My father kept a journal every year of his adult life. He began in the winter of 1948, when he was 21 years old and living in a bunkhouse outside of Prince George, working his first survey contract for the provincial government. He ended in the summer of 1989, when he was 62, and he ended not by letting the practice drop quietly, but by carrying 40 years of green ledger books and black composition notebooks out to the burn barrel behind the woodshed and feeding them into the fire one by one, in the order in which they were written, beginning with the earliest. I watched him do it from the kitchen window. I was 30 years old, home for a visit with my own surveying transit in the truck because we had planned to walk a boundary together, the way we sometimes did when I came back to Valemount. Instead, I stood at the window over the sink and watched my father burn the record of his life. And when I came outside to ask him what he was doing, he did not look up. He said without anger and without particular feeling that a man does not need to leave everything behind when he goes. He said it the way he said most things, which was once and plainly, as though the idea had been fully composed in his mind before he opened his mouth and needed no revision once it was out. I did not argue with him. I went back inside and made coffee, and we walked the boundary that afternoon, and the journals were ash by supper time. I am saying this because I need you to understand what I saved. I need you to understand what it cost him to burn those books and why he burned them. And then I need you to understand that 6 weeks ago, when I drove up to Valemount after my brother Gustave telephoned to say that Papa had died in his sleep at the age of 98, I found one journal that had not burned. It was tucked into the lining of his old surveying bag, the canvas one with the broken brass buckle that he had carried since the 1950s, and that hung on a hook in the back porch for the last 20 years of his life, long after he had stopped carrying it anywhere. Tucked into a pocket someone had sewn into the lining, a pocket I did not know existed, was a small brown leather journal with a water stain on the cover in the shape of a boot heel. The year written on the inside cover in my father's hand was 1971. I am 74 years old. I have spent my entire career measuring land the way my father did and the way my grandfather Philemon did before him. I know how to look at a piece of ground and understand what it is and what it is not. I know how to read the record of a place, the way a piece of ground holds water, the way a ridge deflects wind, the way a creek drainage marks the boundary between what a man can claim and what refuses to be claimed. I am retired now, officially, though I still walk the land around Valemount the way I always have, out of habit, and because my body has not yet learned to stop. I am recording this on a small device on the kitchen table in the house where I grew up, and outside the window the woodshed is throwing a long morning shadow toward the spruce, and the slope above it goes up and up. I am recording this because I believe the 1971 journal should not be lost, and because I am the only person living who was there for the events it describes, and because my father, in not burning it, was telling me something even if he could not say it plainly. He wanted it found. I have thought about that for 6 weeks, and I am certain of it. The homestead outside Valemount is 180 acres. My grandfather acquired it in 1931 and built the house and the barn and the woodshed in the years between then and the war. The house is green-painted clapboard and 2 stories, and in the kitchen there is a window over the sink that looks out across the yard toward the woodshed, and beyond the woodshed is a wall of spruce that goes up a slope and flattens out into what my family always called the back 40. It is not 40 acres, it is closer to 53, but the measurement was my grandfather's, and my grandfather was imprecise about certain things. And by the time my father was old enough to resurvey it, he had already grown up calling it the back 40, and saw no reason to correct a name with a number. The back 40 is a mixed woodland, spruce and fir, and some birch along the creek drainage, with a grassy opening in the lower left corner that my father used for a time as a hay meadow, and later simply let go back to alder and tall grass. There is a property corner marker at the far northeast boundary, a piece of rebar my grandfather set in a cairn of fieldstone in 1938. My father reset it in 1967 when a spring thaw shifted the cairn, and he noted the reset in a separate field survey log that I still have. He was meticulous about the corner marker. He walked to it every spring to confirm it had not moved, and he recorded the date and condition of the marker in his journal each year. This is what I mean when I say he was precise. He was the kind of man who documented the status of a piece of rebar in a cairn of fieldstone every year for 30 years. Not because anyone required him to, but because, as he put it, a measurement that is not confirmed is not a measurement at all. It is only an intention. He had a dog in those years named Cleophas. The dog was a red-tick hound of uncertain age, given to my father by a neighbour named Real Corte, who was moving south and could not take him. Cleophas was large and slow-moving, and had a voice like a church organ when he smelled something in the bush, but what I remember best about him is that he did not startle. Most hounds, in my experience, are easily excited. Cleophas was not. He would sit beside my father in the truck for 6 hours without making a sound, and in the field he walked at my father's heel and stopped when my father stopped, and looked where my father looked. My father did not train this into the dog. The dog simply preferred stillness in the company of my father. I am describing Cleophas because he appears in the 1971 journal, and because what is said about him matters. The first entry that concerns what I am trying to tell you is dated April the 14th, 1971. I was 12 years old. The entry is 3 lines, in my father's small, precise handwriting, which slants slightly to the left, because he was taught penmanship by a left-handed teacher in Terrace, who corrected for the slant and overcorrected. The entry reads, in my translation from his French, which was the language in which he kept his journals: Survey of northeast corner, complete. Corner marker sound, no movement since September. Tracks in mud along the creek drainage, bipedal, 14 inches in length, not bear, not moose, not any animal I recognize. Cleophas sat down and would not approach. That is all. No speculation, no alarm. He noted what he had measured and what he had observed, and he moved on. I have read that entry perhaps 30 times in the last 6 weeks. What strikes me each time is the order. He notes the survey first, the corner marker second, and the tracks third. As though the tracks were an afterthought, or rather as though they were simply one more thing to be noted in the record of the day, no more or less remarkable than the condition of the rebar. This is who my father was. He had spent decades as a land surveyor in the mountains of British Columbia, and he had encountered bears and cougars, and the evidence of things he could not immediately identify. And his response in every case was to note the measurement and move on. But he went back. This is what the journal shows. He went back to the northeast corner on April the 21st, a week later, and again on April the 28th. And on each occasion he noted either tracks or the absence of tracks, the condition of the ground, the direction from which the bipedal impressions seemed to approach. He was surveying it. He was doing to an unexplained set of footprints exactly what he would do to an unexplained boundary discrepancy. Measuring, recording, returning. By the end of April, he had a partial map in the back of the journal, sketched in pencil, showing the approach route he had inferred from 5 separate sets of impressions. The route came down from the ridge to the north, crossed the creek drainage, and ended at a point perhaps 30 feet from the corner marker. Always the same approach, always the same terminus. Whatever was making those tracks was walking to a point 30 feet from the corner marker and stopping. My father wrote, on the last day of April, "I do not know what this is. Cleophas will not go past the alder stand. I will continue to observe." He continued to observe. May and June of 1971 are the richest section of the journal. He went to the back 11 times in those 2 months, sometimes for the stated purpose of checking the meadow fence or cutting firewood, sometimes for no stated purpose at all, which itself is remarkable because my father did not make purposeless trips anywhere. He was a man of reasons. You did not find him in a room without understanding immediately why he had come to that room. And yet, 11 times he walked up the slope to the back 40, with Cleophas at his heel and his compass in his vest pocket and no particular task to perform. And each time he recorded what he saw. What he saw was, at first, very little. On the 3rd of May he found the corner marker cairn disturbed. Not destroyed, not toppled, but rearranged. 2 of the upper field stones had been moved and placed beside the cairn rather than on it, set down with a precision that could not be attributed to wind or animal. He recorded the disturbance, replaced the stones, and noted that the mud around the cairn showed a single set of impressions, the same bipedal tracks, the left foot slightly heavier than the right. He wrote, "Something came to examine the marker. It did not damage the marker. It put the stones down carefully. I have replaced them. I will see whether it returns." It returned. He knew this on the 11th of May, when he found the stones placed beside the cairn again, the same 2 stones, the same careful placement. He replaced them again, and on the journal page he drew a small sketch of the cairn and the placement of the stones, and measured the distance between them, 6 inches apart, parallel to each other, as though they had been set down in that configuration deliberately rather than removed casually. I have thought about those 2 stones for 6 weeks. I have thought about the quality of attention implied by the careful placement, the parallel alignment, the fact that it was always the same 2 stones, the same positions. My father's notes on the subject are factual. He reports, he measures, he records. But I know him well enough to read what he did not write, which is that he was moved by it. He was moved by the evidence of intention. In June of 1971, he saw the creature for the first time. He had gone to the back 40 on a Tuesday morning, the 8th of June. The meadow needed checking. He wrote that he had walked the fence line and found 2 posts that needed resetting, and had done the work himself and was heading back toward the house when Cleophas, at his heel, sat down. Not abruptly. The dog lowered himself to the ground in the way he did when he had decided to stop moving, which was a deliberate and unhurried motion, and he did not make a sound. My father turned around. The creature was standing at the edge of the spruce on the far side of the meadow. My father estimated the distance at 70 feet. He wrote, "It stood upright. It was very large, 8 or 9 feet, I believe, though at that distance it is difficult to be certain. The fur was dark brown, nearly black. It stood quite still. It was watching me." I had the impression, which I cannot fully account for, that it had been there for some time before I turned. He also wrote, and this is the sentence I return to most often, "I was not afraid." He noted that without explanation and without any particular pride. He was not afraid. He stood in the June meadow with his dog sitting at his heel, and looked across 70 feet of grass at something that should not exist, and he was not afraid. He wrote that they stood that way for perhaps 3 minutes, the creature at the tree line and himself in the meadow, and then the creature turned without haste and moved back into the spruce, and was gone. Cleophas stood up, and they walked back to the house. He told no one. The journal makes this clear, not through any explicit statement, but through the simple fact that in the pages of that June, the references to the creature are careful and private, and contain no mention of my mother, of me or Gustave, of the neighbour Margot Pellerine, who lived 2 properties east and who stopped in most Saturdays for coffee. He was a man who discussed things when there was a reason to discuss them, and he apparently judged in the summer of 1971 that there was not yet a reason. July and August carry shorter entries. He went to the back 40 less frequently in those months because there was other work. Summer being the season when a surveyor's contract load is heaviest and the days long enough to get through the fieldwork that winter had deferred. He was out 4 days that July on a boundary dispute in the Robson Valley and 2 days in Clearwater on a subdivision, and the journal entries for those weeks are about measurements and discrepancies and the names of landowners whose properties he was working. The ordinary professional record of an ordinary professional summer. He checked the cairn twice in July. The stones were undisturbed. He noted this both times without elaboration. But I think he was also waiting in the particular way he waited for things, which was without visible impatience. He was a man who understood that you do not approach a survey point from every direction at once. You establish your datum and you let the secondary measurements confirm it. He had established his datum, which was that the creature existed, was enormous, and was not afraid of him, and he was letting the summer confirm whether what he had seen would come again. It came again on the 17th of August. He was cutting firewood in the back 40, alone, because Gustave was 12, and I was 12, and my mother had taken us both to visit her sister in Kamloops, and my father had used the empty house as a reason to catch up on work he had been deferring. He was splitting rounds near the stand of birch when he heard, at some point in the late afternoon, a sound he had not heard before. He described it as low and resonant, more like a sustained note than a call, something between the sound a large animal makes when settling and the sound of a cello string struck very slowly. He stood with his axe and listened. The sound came twice and then stopped. He wrote, "I answered it. I am not certain why. I made a sound I would not have been able to reproduce intentionally. Something low in my throat. One note." Then I waited. There was a pause in the journal entries at this point. Not a literal pause, but the sentence that follows is shorter than any of the surrounding sentences, and it is the only sentence on its page. It answered me. He wrote nothing more for that day. On the next page, dated the 18th of August, he wrote a longer entry describing the quality of the sound, the probable direction, the distance he estimated by how the sound moved through the spruce canopy. He wrote it the way he would have written a field observation, with compass headings and a note on wind direction, as though the sound were a physical feature of the terrain that could be charted. But at the bottom of the 18th, he wrote one sentence that was not a measurement. I believe it recognized my voice as a separate thing from the axe and the splitting. I read that sentence to my brother Gustave on the telephone, and he was quiet for a long time, and then he said that he did not know what to say. I told him that was all right. Papa did not always know what to say either. It had not stopped him from writing it down. The fall of 1971 is when the exchange began in earnest. This is my word, exchange. My father did not use it. He recorded what he left at the corner marker cairn and what he found there on his next visit. And he recorded these things in the same flat, descriptive language he used for everything. But the pattern is what I am calling an exchange. He began leaving small things on the cairn. The lid of his lunch tin, cleaned and placed flat. A piece of survey flagging tape, red and white. A cedar shingle he had been using as a marker stake. On the next visit, the lid of the lunch tin had been turned upside down. The flagging tape had been wound carefully around the top of the rebar stake, not tied, wound, in an even spiral. The shingle had been moved approximately 8 inches and placed at a right angle to its original position. He left nothing the next time to see what would happen. On the following visit, he found a small round stone, dark grey granite, placed on top of the cairn in the centre. It was not a stone from anywhere near the cairn. He could not identify its source. He wrote, "I have been carrying this stone in my vest pocket for a week. It fits in my palm." He still had that stone when he died. I found it in the same vest pocket, the canvas surveying vest that hung on the same hook as the surveying bag. I recognized it from his description without knowing I was recognizing it. A small round stone, dark grey granite. I have it now. There is something I need to tell you about the October of 1971 that I know from the journal, but also from my own memory, because I was there and because this is the only part of the story in which my father brought anyone else to the back 40 during those months. He took me on a Sunday afternoon in the middle of October. I was 12 years old and the leaves were off the birch, and the light was the thin, flat light of a BC mountain fall. And my father appeared in the kitchen doorway and said, simply, that he was walking up to the back 40 and that I could come if I wanted to. He did not tell me why. My mother was at the table and she looked at him and then at me and said nothing either. We walked up the slope with Cleophas between us. My father did not speak during the walk. He often did not speak. I was accustomed to his silences in the way that a child grows accustomed to the particular qualities of the weather in the place where she lives. And I had learned by 12 that his silences were not indifference, but rather a form of attention that he extended equally to the world and to the people he loved. We stopped at the edge of the meadow, near the stand of birch where he cut the firewood. My father stood and looked at the tree line on the far side. Cleophas sat down. I did not see anything. I want to be honest about this. I stood beside my father for what I believe was 20 minutes, though at 12 your sense of time is not reliable, and I looked at the spruce on the far side of the meadow, and I saw only spruce. My father was still beside me. He did not point. He did not speak. After the 20 minutes, he said, in French, that we should go back for supper, and we walked back down the slope. I did not ask him what we had been looking at. I did not ask for the next 40 years, because I knew my father and I knew that whatever he had been looking at was his to keep until he was ready. And I had grown up understanding in the particular way that children understand things before they have words for them, that the back 40 was a place my father kept separate. The journal tells me what he saw that afternoon. On the same date, the 14th of October, he wrote a single entry, longer than most. I brought Dorothy today. I did not intend to tell her what I have seen, but I wanted it to see her. I do not know why this seemed important, only that it did. It was in the spruce for most of the time we stood there. Cleophas knew. Dorothy did not look at the right place. It watched her for a long time, and then it moved back up the ridge. When I looked at my daughter's face, she was looking at the sky, which was turning pink above the spruce. She did not see it, but it saw her, and I believe that was what I wanted. I have read that passage more times than any other passage in the journal. I have thought about what my father was doing, what instinct or intention moved a man of his particular reserve to bring his 12-year-old daughter to stand in a cold meadow, so that something he had met in the forest could look at her. I do not know fully. I think it was something like an introduction. I think my father, who measured things and recorded them and trusted the record, believed that what lived on the ridge above his homestead should know the members of his family, and that knowing them might be a form of protection he could not offer in any other way. I think he trusted it. I think that trust was earned across 6 months of careful, patient, mutual observation, and that by October of 1971 my father had arrived at a certainty he could not put into words, which was that the creature that examined his corner marker and returned his low-sung note and placed a riverstone on his cairn was not a danger to his children. He did not need to explain this. He demonstrated it by standing in the meadow with his daughter without a rifle, without a warning, without anything between them and the tree line except the autumn air and his own quiet understanding. He told no one about any of this. Not my mother, not Margot Pellerin, not Gustav, not anyone at the survey office. The 1971 journal was the only record. He continued to walk the back 40 in subsequent years, as he always had, and he continued to note the condition of the corner marker in his annual spring survey logs. And I do not know whether the contact continued in the years after 1971 because I do not have those journals. He burned them. But I think it continued. I think it continued for a long time, and I think the burning, when it happened, was not because it had stopped. He burned the journals in July of 1989. I have told you this already. I watched from the kitchen window. By that time, I was living in Prince George and had been for 5 years, working for the same survey office where my father had started. I was home for a week's visit. My mother was still alive then, not yet ill, sitting in the front room with her mending while my father fed his life into the burn barrel. And I want to be clear that she did not go to the window. She knew he was burning them. She had known he would someday, the way you know a thing that has been agreed upon without being spoken. She sat with her mending and let him burn them. I went outside when the barrel was half full of ash. I said, "Papa, those are your journals." He said, without looking up, that he knew what they were. I said that I thought it was a loss, which was perhaps the most direct thing I had ever said to him about a personal matter. He said that some things should not outlast the person who knows how to read them correctly. He said this without bitterness and without self-pity. He said it the way you state a principle of surveying, as though the logic were self-evident and the conclusion unavoidable. I went back inside. I have thought about what he said for 35 years. Some things should not outlast the person who knows how to read them correctly. I believed when he said it that he was protecting himself, the way a man protects himself when he has kept a secret long enough that the secret has become part of his structure, and he cannot imagine what he would be without it. I believed he was afraid. Not of the creature. I understood by then that fear was not something he carried about the creature, but afraid of what the journals would mean in the hands of someone who did not know how to hold them. He was afraid of exactly what happened to me. Reading the 1971 journal at the kitchen table 6 weeks ago. He was afraid of someone reading the record and going up to the back 40 with a purpose other than his own. But he did not burn the 1971 journal. I found it in the lining of the surveying bag on the morning of the second day after his death. I was not looking for it. I was taking the bag down from the hook to move it, because Gustav's wife wanted to clean the porch, and I felt the weight in the lining, and I felt the particular stiffness that is a small book rather than a folded paper. And I opened the seam, which had been re-sewn with a finer thread than the rest of the bag, a thread I recognized as my mother's mending thread. She had sewn the pocket. She had sewn it around the journal. She had known, and she had helped him, and she had not said a word about it in the 30 years between the burning and her death in 1998. I sat on the porch steps with the bag in my lap for a long time before I opened the journal. I thought about my mother, Odette, who had died in 1998, and who had sat at the mending table in 1989 without going to the window. She had sewn the pocket in the lining. She had chosen the thread. She had done this the way she did most things, which was quietly and without annotation, and she had taken the knowledge of what she had done to her grave with the same equanimity with which she had taken everything else. I thought about what it meant that she had known. Not only what my father had found on the back 40, but what the journals contained. She had known, and she had helped him hide the one he could not burn, and she had said nothing to me in the 30 years of her life after the burning. I have thought about that for 6 weeks, and I have decided it was not a betrayal. It was the same thing Margot Pellerin did when she went home from the fence line without telling her husband. It was the understanding that some knowledge is custody, not possession, and that custody requires you to know when to pass it on and when to hold it. She held it until my father could arrange for it to be found. I opened the journal on the porch steps in the October light, and then I took it inside and read it at the kitchen table with the pot of coffee going cold beside me. And I have been reading it again since. And now I am recording what it says for anyone who should know it. There is one more entry I need to tell you about. It is the last entry in the journal, written on the 31st of December, 1971, in my father's small left slanting hand. He did not usually make end-of-year entries. It was not a practice of his. But on that last day of the year, he wrote a short paragraph that is unlike anything else in the journal, which is to say it contains, for the first and only time in his recorded life as far as I know, something that might be called philosophy. He wrote, "I have been thinking about what it means to measure a piece of land and to say, on the basis of that measurement, that the land belongs to someone. I have done this work for 23 years, and I have never questioned the premise. But the back 40 has made me question it. I measured the back 40. I confirmed the corner markers. I recorded the acreage. I did everything a surveyor is required to do. And something else was there before I arrived and will be there after I am gone. And it examined my corner marker with as much care as I examined it, and I do not think it recognized my claim. I do not think it was capable of recognizing my claim, not because it was not intelligent, but because the category of the claim was simply outside the world it lived in. The back 40 is not mine. I measured it. That is all I did. That is the last sentence in the journal. I measured it. That is all I did. I am a land surveyor. I have spent 52 years measuring land, which means that I have spent 52 years in the presence of a truth my father arrived at in 1971. And I have never put it the way he put it on that last day of December. I have thought about it for 6 weeks, and I think he is right. I think that is all any of us ever did. Margot Pellerin is 91 years old and still living 2 properties east. I drove out to see her last week, 3 days ago, with the journal in my coat pocket. I did not tell her what I had. I sat in her kitchen and we drank tea, and I asked her, without any particular framing, whether she had ever noticed anything unusual about the back 40 in the years when my father was still active on the land. She looked at me for a long time. She is 91, but her eyes have not changed. She set down her cup, and she said, in the same flat, deliberate way that the people of that generation speak, "Your father asked me, once, not to walk the fence line on the north side of the back 40 in the spring. He said there were bear signs. I never believed it was bear signs. I did not ask him what it was. I asked her whether she had ever seen anything. She said, 'Once.' In the spring of 1974, I was checking my own fence and I stopped because I saw your father standing at the edge of the spruce on the north slope, and he was looking up at something. I was too far to see clearly. It was very large, whatever it was, and it was standing upright. And after a moment it moved back into the trees, and your father stood there for another minute, and then went back down the slope. I went home and I did not tell my husband. I said, Why not? She picked up her cup and held it between both palms the way she always has, to warm her hands, and she said, "Because it was your father's. It was not mine to tell." I drove home from Margot Pellerin's house in the late afternoon, and the sky above the mountains was the particular deep blue of a BC October evening. The same blue it was 53 years ago, when my father and I stood in the meadow and he showed me something I did not know I was being shown. I have thought about that drive for 3 days. I have thought about Margot, who is 91 and who kept a thing that was not hers to tell for 50 years, because she understood, with the instinctive moral precision of someone who has lived her whole life in proximity to other people's silences, that not every witness is entitled to speak. My father wanted this journal found. He left it in the bag, and he asked my mother to sew the pocket, and she sewed it with her own thread, and he hung the bag on the hook in the porch where it would wait. He waited 52 years for the right moment, which turned out to be the moment he was no longer there to be asked about it, which was perhaps the only moment when the asking could be answered without cost to the thing he was protecting. The back 40 is still there. I walked it the morning after I read the journal, alone, in the early light. The corner marker is where my grandfather set it and where my father reset it, and where I have confirmed it myself 3 times in my career, the last time in 2019. The cairn is sound. The spruce on the north slope is thicker than it was in 1971, grown up through what was once a more open canopy, and the creek drainage has shifted a foot or two to the east, which happens. I stood at the corner marker for a while. It was not the same as standing there with my father. It was quieter in a different way, a way that had to do with being alone rather than with being still. And I did not hear anything or see anything, and Cleophas has been dead since 1979, and there was nothing at my heel. But I stood there for a long time, the way my father taught me to stand in a place, which is without expectation and without hurry, giving the place the same quality of attention you would want given to you if you were the place. I put the small grey stone on top of the cairn when I left, the one from his vest pocket, the one that fit in his palm. I set it in the centre, the way he described finding it set, and I left it there. The journal is in my coat pocket as I record this. I do not know what I will do with it. I do not believe it belongs in an archive. I do not believe it belongs destroyed. My father found a third path, which was to put it somewhere between those 2 places and let time decide, and I think that was probably the right call. What I know is that my father measured the back 53 years ago, and something came down off the ridge to examine the marker he had set, and they spent a year observing each other with the same careful patience. And my father brought me there on a Sunday afternoon in October so that it could see me, and it watched me from the spruce while I looked at the sky turning pink, and it knew me from that day forward even though I did not know it. I have been up on the back 40 many times since 1971. I have not known until 6 weeks ago that I was known. He measured it. That is all he did. And something already there knew the measurement was his way of saying hello. And it answered him the same way, with a careful placing of stones, with a low sustained note that crossed the birch stand in the August air, with a river stone set on a cairn by a pair of hands that had no business knowing what a cairn was for. That is what I saved. That is what he meant me to save. I am going to close the recording now. The coffee is cold, and the light through the kitchen window is the late morning light, and the surveying bag is on the table beside me, the canvas bag with the broken brass buckle. And if I look out the window past the woodshed, I can see the slope going up toward the back 40, the spruce dark above the yellowed grass, and the sky above it very clear and very large. He would have noted the weather conditions. He would have written the date and the time and the state of the sky. He was that kind of man. December the 3rd, 0940 hours, sky clear, no wind. The back 40 appears undisturbed.